You're pulling too fast.
You're pulling too slow. We don't want the Kraken to catch us.
I'm saving me strength for when it comes. And I don't think it's Kraken anyways. Always heard it said Kraken.
Oh, with a long A?
Uh-huh.
No. Kraken's how it's pronounced in the original Scandinavian, and Kraken's closer to that.
Well, we ain't original Scandinavians, are we? Kraken.
It's a mythological creature and calls it what I want.
Welcome back, everybody. This is GDS. Welcome to Kraken Week. Before we start this video, I want you to tell me in the blah blah below, what's the largest creature that you have run successfully in 5th edition? This is a small channel and I don't get many comments, so if you comment below, I'm gonna see it and heart it and probably respond, so let's get a conversation going. I also want to acknowledge that I now have a background which is just like a ground but in your back. I've got several cool things here. I have a MCDM book, and I have an unopened copy of Seven Wonders Duel and other such great things. There are several things which make running the Kraken in 5th edition non-trivial. If we can identify those things, then we can improve and optimize our experience of running the Kraken. So let's jump straight into it. The first problem is that there's an essential contradiction between running a creature like the Kraken and the mechanics of the game. Specifically, the system that's used to run, say, an encounter of a group of goblins fighting in adventures on land doesn't work too well for running a massive creature fighting a ship in the ocean. The reason for that is that many things make sense in the typical fighting system of 5th edition when you run goblins, but not when you run the Kraken. Things like grid-based creature size and 60 feet of swim movement and trading attacks just doesn't lend itself too well when you run the Kraken. That said, there is a contradiction here. The majority of character abilities within the game of 5th edition are to do with the combat system. So if we want players to be able to use their characters and make use of the choices they made when they made their characters, we have to engage with that combat system. The second contradiction here is that the Kraken should be an epic fight. You don't want the players to be able to just swing their sticks at it or their swords or cast spells at it and zap it with lightning or fire or bows and whatever and kill it that way. Hitting it very hard, like you do for goblins, shouldn't work. Even so, like we just said, we don't want hitting hard and casting spells to be useless, because that's 90% of what our characters are able to do with their mechanics. So our solution for running the Kraken is going to need to resolve these contradictions. Another issue of running the Kraken, besides just the contradictions between the system and the Kraken, is that the stat block that's supposed to tell you how to run this thing is not very useful for telling you how to run this thing. In fact, it has a lot of useless information. Later in this video, I'll be expounding more detail on this, but just as a few examples, it says it's a gargantuan monstrosity, in parentheses Titan, which you already know about the Kraken because it's a Kraken, and it says it's chaotic evil, which just doesn't matter. So when we make a solution, our solution will need to include the useful information, and only that information, in the new stat block. Now that we know the problems with the Triceratops, we can come up with solutions to optimize the experience of running it. So we're going to need to 1. Engage with a combat system without making the fight not epic, and while still making the fight fun. So let's start. Let me read off my notes here. We can make combat fun while still engaging with the combat mechanics of 5th edition, where characters have most of their abilities, by fulfilling some parts of the Kraken fantasy before combat, and making unique mechanics that twist 5e to fulfill the rest of the Kraken fantasy in combat. So we will be analyzing the Krakosaurus Rex from the same design principles that I did in my video called The Worst Part of Any ttrpg is Playing It. And this has 3 steps. 1. We will be identifying the fantasy of the Kraken, i.e. what feelings and thoughts are evoked when you think of the Triceratops. 2. We will be using this fantasy to create a set of goals for our Kraken encounter, i.e. specific things we want to happen to evoke the feelings and thoughts that the fantasy evokes. And then 3, we're going to try to figure out what mechanics, real things that happen and interact with the game, we can make that fulfill the goals which fulfill the fantasy. If this still sounds confusing, I recommend that you check out that video that I was talking about. Link is going to be here or here, I can never remember. So what is the fantasy of the Kraken? I have a list of a few things and let's read through it. So the cuckoo is epic and extremely powerful. Another important feeling that is evoked for me with the Kraken is, like many epic enemies, the feeling of I don't know how we're going to win. This is classic hero's journey, the moment before the final fight where the hero has some self-doubt and really doesn't think they can win and fall into an abyss of despair. Implied in this feeling is the need to come up with answers to level the playing field and make the fight possible. To go from, there is no way we can possibly win this, to, wait a minute, say that again. If only we could, and then something like that. Some other feelings that are evoked, I'm just going to read off here, is a slow and dramatic start as you realize that the Kraken is upon you. And then when you actually fight the Kraken, you find out that it can break ships in half like they were made out of Legos, and it likes to grab people with its tentacles and suck them into the abyss. And maybe another thought that occurs to me about fighting Krakens is that when the tentacle tries to grab you, you can chop them off. And maybe if you chop off all the tentacles, then the Kraken dies. So now I've identified what I think today is the fantasy of the Kraken. This could change tomorrow, and from person to person. You might have a different idea of what fighting the Kraken is like. Pursue that. Whatever you come up with, let's come up with our goals. We're going to derive the goals from the fantasy. We want the players to have to do something outside of combat to put the odds in their favor and level the playing field. Otherwise, the Kraken is an epic creature. It's just too strong and too fast. So one example of this is players can get a fleet of ships and equip them with large harpoon guns where the harpoons are tied with a rope to large empty barrels. So when they hit the Kraken, if you hit the Kraken with enough barrels, it will be forced to float where you can actually fight it. I know I'm reading off my notes here, but this is really important, so I want to make sure I get this right. Usually, players can use their stats, weapons, and spells to solve problems. But suddenly, those things alone, when you fight something like the Kraken, are not enough. So they need to start thinking outside of those things and actually solve a problem. That problem being, how in the world are we going to bring down this monster? This can be scary as a GM, because you can't rely on the combat system. I.e., you have to be the one to be resolving the ambiguity in the player's decisions. The rules won't help you do that as much, but I promise you that this will work as long as you collaborate with the players. So don't give them solutions, but make sure to correct errors that would be obviously wrong to the characters, and to clarify doubts about the outcomes of certain actions. When players can't use their character sheets to solve a problem, they're going to start asking you questions about your world. Be prepared to answer those questions. I don't know how your players will do this. I don't know how your players will do this. That will depend on them. Don't make an answer, and remind your players that you don't have an answer. But enable their creative thinking by helping them stay within the constraints of what could work in your world. I remember running a level 3 campaign to some of my players, and I threw a dragon at them because I was like, this is their first time playing Dungeons & Dragons, and you gotta have the dragon experience. And one of the players who has actually played D&D before said, we can't defeat a dragon at level 3. I don't know how we're gonna win this. And then he looked at me, and then I said, I don't know how you're gonna win this. And that was true. But they still came up with a plan, pulled something out of the hat, and won. They always do. Some of the most fun I've had running D&D is letting players come up with crazy inventive solutions and winning the day, defeating an impossible foe. Let your players surprise you and cheer with them when they win. These are our goals for the Krakenar encounter. We want a slow dramatic start, we want some ship to break in half, we want the Kraken to be able to grab some people and pull them into the sea, and we want players to chop off tentacles when they fight the Crocodile. Now for part 3. We have our goals. What actual, concrete, specific mechanics fulfill those goals? Like we said, players are going to need to do something outside of combat to fight the Crocodile. So in this stage of the encounter design, we're not going to be interacting with the combat mechanics. This is going to be cinematic and narrative. I think this encounter, because the players need to be prepared, will be once the players already know some things about the Kraken and maybe have already encountered it. Maybe they're tracking it down by following whale carcasses or ink. Or maybe the Kraken was injured in a previous encounter and they're following its trail of blood. Once they're close to the Kraken, I want to make sure that I deliver an epic and foreboding feeling before the Kraken fight actually starts. So in order to do that, I'm going to imagine that I am them on that ship waiting to see the Kraken. And then I'm going to write down some very brief and evocative sensory descriptions. Keep in mind that 1, we remember negative experiences much better than we do positive ones. And 2, sensory memories of smell and hearing are a lot more powerful than sight. So if you can focus on those or tell those first, that would be best. So here are some examples I wrote down. You can obviously do whatever you want. You are surrounded by ocean. You have knowledge, not fear, that you are far from civilization or assistance. Maybe you can describe the stench of decomposing fish and algae. You can feel the salty mist of the ocean waves shattering against the front of your ship. The ocean is clear. The waves come up and down from a claustrophobic, endless, dark abyss. And maybe you can hear deep sounds of clicking and cracking resonate through the ship. You may not be alone. It's very likely that in their preparation and their plan, the players will bring multiple ships. This is great because in the French tradition, we can kill them to make a point. Maybe the players suddenly see tentacles below their ship, and the tentacles shoot out from the water and grab some of the NPC crew members and sink them into the depth. But the players manage to narrowly escape. And then maybe the Kraken catches, instead of their ship, an NPC ship and just crunches it in half. You can describe in as much detail as you want what this experience is like. Maybe the players can hear the screams of the crew in the distance as they slide towards the maw of the Kraken. So we've established a bunch of things that we wanted to establish to evoke certain feelings in the Krakedon. Awesome. Next, the players are going to actually spring their plan and level the playing field. Once the playing field is level, not only is the crackle weakened, so characters can reasonably fight it, but it's also constrained. This is good because this state makes it easier to fit the Kraken into the combat system of 5th edition. Double win. At this point, let's make our stat block. Let's focus on getting rid of all the crap we don't need and filling it with useful things that fulfill our goals. We can steal numbers like damage, AC, and DCs from the original Kraken sheet. Why not? Another important thing to keep in mind is to give goal-fulfilling mechanics high to hit values. We want them to affect at least one player who fails the save or has an AC that's too low. We want our mechanics to, in fact, fulfill the goal and not just miss. So let's see what we need and don't need in the stat block. Gargantuan Monstrosity, already knew that. Chaotic Evil, doesn't matter. Values for stats, I only need the modifiers. Proficiency bonus, I don't need to know it. It says it's amphibious, so it can breathe in water and in air. That's obvious, I don't need that spelled out. Damage immunities, not necessary, and I don't think a part of the fantasy of their Krakedon. Condition immunities, kind of obvious, you wouldn't be able to just paralyze the entire Kraken. Language, it's a Kraken. I don't think you'll be having a debate with a Kraken, but maybe that might be interesting. But for this encounter, it's more of an animal than an intelligent creature. Senses, not really necessary. I don't see how I would use it. Legendary actions, not necessary. Damage types, obvious. You know, they crunch you with the tentacle, and usually unnecessary. I'm going to put the final stat block that we come up with in the nonsense below. Please take a look. It's pure text, which is great. You can copy paste it into your notes. It's also small enough to fit in your notes. Double win. So first, I'm going to just yank the stats and saving throws and put them in a way that doesn't take an entire span of a page. And then I'm going to say the Kraken has 8 tentacles, and when you kill all 8 tentacles, the Kraken dies. What I'm going to do now is just give the Kraken a bunch of abilities. Let me read off. Once per round, when it's the turn of the Kraken, it raises all living tentacles from the water and attacks the nearest target to each tentacle. And let's say the tentacles can reach anywhere on the ship because they're very long. The tentacles will stay there until the Kraken's next turn. So every time the Kraken attacks, it can also be attacked. Speaking of, I'm just going to lift the AC for the tentacles, so they're going to have each an AC of 18, and then I'm going to divide the HP of the Kraken in 8 and assign that number to each of the tentacles. let's say 60 HP. And then I'm going to also lift the attack and do some math to divide it, so it's going to be plus 17 to hit, and it's going to deal 1d6 damage plus 4. Next, a bunch more abilities. Once per combat, it's going to swipe the whole deck with its tentacles. This is a DC 25 saving throw, dexterity, or take 3d6 plus 10 damage, I stole that number from the original sheet, as you are hit, flung, and smashed against the wall of the ship. It's important when you run large creatures like this to give it an ability to attack and deal damage to all characters at once. Another once per combat ability, when you miss an attack on a tentacle, make a DC 10 strength saving throw. If you succeed, it tries to grab you, but you narrowly escape and it grabs your weapon instead. When it realizes it didn't grab you, it tosses the weapon to somewhere on the deck of the ship. And if you fail, say it slaps you and you take 3d6 plus 10 damage. The reason I set the DC low here is because I want the players to succeed. I want the drama of them almost being grabbed, but then it takes their weapon and throws it away. That just sounds cool to me. Another once per combat ability, when a tentacle hits you with an attack, make a DC 30 strength saving throw. If you succeed, you manage to not be grabbed. But if you fail, the tentacle grabs you and flails you around in the air. And then, unless someone deals, say, 10 damage to the tentacle, the Kraken is going to eat you next turn. The reason the DC is high here is because I want the grab to work and for you to be flailed around and almost eaten, but the reason the damage is 10 is because I don't want you to just instantly die. Here's another once per combat. When you hit a tentacle with a ranged attack or spell, it will immediately rush to you and try to grab and squeeze you. Make a DC 30 strength saving throw or take 3d6 plus 10 damage, and become squeezed as it's flailing you around in the air. On your next turn, make a DC 15 strength saving throw to escape, or take another 3d6 plus 10. On your turn after that, the Kraken is going to let go. Same story as the abilities before, I'm trying to make mechanics that fulfill the goals that we established. Last move here, it says once per combat, when the tentacle has 2 tentacles left, it's going to grab the ship with its 2 tentacles in the middle and start to crack it inwards. When the players attack the tentacles, the Kraken will let go, but the ship will be somewhat damaged, and the fight will continue until the players win. You might say that setting up all these narrative moments in the combat feels like railroading, or feels like it's breaking verisimilitude because the Kraken kind of fits a dramatic structure that it wouldn't in a real world. I encourage you to check out a video called Verisimilitude is Making You a Problem GM. It's not as controversial as it sounds, but I think it's important. The main thesis of the video is that that's what would really happen, is the GM equivalent of that's what my character would do. It can be a reasonable justification, but it doesn't work by itself. In this case, giving the assumptions that we're making, running a D&D combat, running a D&D game, running an encounter with a Kraken, I think these narrative beats make sense. Watch that video for more detail. That's it for the Kraken. To me, this fight sounds epic, and as I said, our stat block is pure text, so you can copy paste it, and it actually fits onto a reasonable page of notes, which is great. That's pretty much it. I've never run this specific encounter, but that's how I would go about it. If you run this, I want to know how it went and what you ended up having to change in order to make it work for your game, because I know for a fact you will probably need to change something. So what we did in this video is identified some issues with running the Kruk-doodle in D&D. And then we fixed those issues by redesigning the Kruk-a-doo from first principles, starting with a fantasy, and then identifying goals, and identifying what kind of mechanics fulfill those goals. I hope you liked the video. If you made it this far, maybe consider hitting your face with a like button. Especially if you're using a touch screen, that can be an effective strategy to click anything on the screen. Maybe try to smash your head into it an odd number of times. Let's go for 11. Get a real concussion going. Unless you're not using a touch screen, in that case, just press it 11 times with your mouse. Once you've pressed the like button an odd number of times, make sure to smash the subscribe button. If your computer monitor is still intact after subscribing, you have failed your purpose. Make sure to hit that notification bell to get notifications. I can't tell you how much this stuff helps, because I honestly don't know, and I really don't think anyone does, but I hear it does. So thanks for doing that, and I'll see you later.